Boring history for sleep. Bizarre justice. The wildest punishments in Roman history. Welcome. You're about to enter a slower world, a quieter world, where the clamor of modern life fades away and the soft echoes of the past begin to unfold like waves in a still sea. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of ancient Rome. Not the Rome of triumphal arches, soaring aqueducts, or bustling forums, but the Rome of punishment, justice, strange justice, brutal, symbolic, and sometimes bewilderingly bizarre justice. In this episode of Boring History for Sleep, we're going to drift through the darker corridors of the Roman legal system, where punishments weren't merely penalties, they were performances. Morality plays enacted on bodies, symbolic acts woven with animals, fire, iron, and spectacle. They were meant to terrify, to instruct, and above all, to maintain order in the sprawling chaos of the empire. But don't worry, we'll go slowly. Very slowly. Each story, each punishment told in a way that will both intrigue your mind and gently cradle it into sleep. Before we begin, I want to invite you to stay with us until the very end of this video. Let the rhythm of the words carry you. Let the slowness of history wrap around you like a soft blanket. And while you're here, perhaps take a moment to share in the comments what you're feeling right now. Are you surprised? Curious? Sleepy already? All responses are welcome. Now, let's begin. The Romans, masters of administration and conquerors of continents, were also masters of symbolic cruelty. Their punishments were often public, theatrical, and tailored to the crime, not just in a legal sense, but in a moral, philosophical sense. To commit a crime in ancient Rome wasn't just to break a law, it was to disrupt the very order of things. That disruption had to be corrected. Loudly, visibly, and memorably. Let us begin with one of the strangest punishments of all. One that seems almost mythological in its construction, yet was very real. The poena culae, or the punishment of the sack. This was a sentence reserved for parricides, those who killed their own father. To the Romans, this was the most unnatural act a human could commit. Patricide wasn't just a personal crime, it was a cosmological crime. And the punishment reflected that belief. When someone was convicted of this horrific act, they weren't merely executed. No, they were sewn into a leather sack, but not alone. Alongside them in the sack were 4 animals: a dog, a monkey, a rooster, and a serpent. Why these animals? Each had symbolic meaning. The dog, a companion now turned attacker. The monkey, a distorted image of humanity echoing the moral degradation of the killer. The rooster, a harbinger of dawn and judgment. And the serpent, ancient symbol of deceit and death, all crammed into the sack with the condemned. Then, the sack was tightly sealed and thrown into a river. Imagine that moment. The darkness, the snarling, the flapping, the hissing. No room to move, no air to breathe. The sloshing of water outside, waiting to fill your lungs. There's no escape, no sound beyond the surface. Just the sack, slipping into the current, swallowed by the river, swallowed by silence. This was not just punishment, it was ritual. The combination of animals created a grotesque bestiary of symbolic horror. The killer's crime wasn't just being avenged, it was being reversed, undone through metaphor and fear. Society watched, or at least knew, that the universe had been put right again. This punishment was not a one-time event. It existed across centuries, revived and adjusted, as the empire evolved. And even when the animals varied, the core remained: the sack, the horror, the water. It was Roman justice in its most symbolic, surreal form. You might be wondering, was this effective? Did it deter? Possibly. But deterrence wasn't always the goal. Often, punishment in Rome was a kind of moral theater. a way to remind citizens, slaves, senators, and emperors alike, that Rome was order, and order must be preserved at all costs. As you breathe slowly now, you might picture that sack on the riverbank. Quiet soldiers standing by, the wind through the cypress trees, a moment of stillness, and then the sack, sliding silently into the water. And then, nothing. Only the sound of the river. In the next part, we'll journey into the Colosseum, not for gladiator games, but for public executions, where criminals were punished not in silence, but before roaring crowds in ways designed to entertain as much as they punished. But for now, let this image fade. Let your thoughts slow. Let the steady rhythm of history lull you further toward sleep. Let us now drift deeper, gently, into the world of Roman punishment, no longer hidden in sacks or beneath the surface of the Tiber River, but instead brought into the full light of day under the blazing Mediterranean sun. In this part of the story, justice emerges from the shadows and takes its place upon the stage, quite literally. We arrive at the amphitheater, not just the grand Colosseum of Rome, but smaller arenas scattered across the empire, from Gaul to Asia Minor, where dust and stone held echoes of screams, and where punishment became performance. To the Roman mind, justice was not merely about law. It was spectacle, control, and order, and in many cases, it was meant to be remembered. For many criminals, especially those convicted of serious crimes, murder, treason, desertion, theft, arson, their sentence would be to face death, not in private, but in public, in a way the audience would never forget. Executions were carefully choreographed events. The audience was not passive. They watched, judged, and cheered, or sometimes even jeered. These events were called damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The convicted person, often stripped of identity, clothes, and dignity, was sent into the arena to face wild animals. Lions, leopards, bears, and boars, imported from distant corners of the empire, were starved and agitated to ensure a violent show. There was no defense. The condemned had no weapons. This was not combat. It was not a duel. It was slaughter, wrapped in ritual, and given the rhythm of entertainment. Some of these executions took place at noon, during the intermission of gladiator games. Audiences would eat lunch while watching death. Children sat with their families. Senators sat in the shade of the imperial box. It was considered a natural part of the Roman day. Life and death, violence and bread, all woven together in a cultural fabric that seems shocking to us, but to them was simply normal. But it wasn't always as straightforward as setting a lion loose. Sometimes the executions were designed with narrative flair. Criminals would be cast in mythological roles. A thief might be forced to reenact the myth of Prometheus, chained to a rock, as a vulture or eagle was trained to attack. Another might play the role of Orpheus, surrounded by animals that ultimately turned on him. The performance ended in real blood, art imitating life, or perhaps life imitating myth, until the two were indistinguishable. The executioners were sometimes actors, stagehands, or trained animal handlers. They rehearsed. The scenery was painted. There was music. Everything had a purpose, a rhythm, a structure. It was death as drama. To the audience, this served many purposes. It reinforced Roman superiority over nature, over criminals, over chaos. It demonstrated what happened to those who broke the rules, and it provided an afternoon's amusement. These were not rare occasions. During certain imperial festivals, hundreds of people could be executed in a single day. You may be wondering, what kinds of people were subjected to these punishments? The answer is complex. Slaves were especially vulnerable. A runaway slave who committed violence could easily find themselves in the arena. Foreigners, pirates, soldiers who deserted, political enemies, Christians during certain periods of persecution. The arena became a place of judgment not only for crime but for identity. Who you were determined how you would die. There is one recorded instance during the reign of Emperor Caligula in which he supposedly ordered an entire section of the audience, those who complained of boredom, to be dragged into the arena and executed, simply to restore his mood. Whether this is true or exaggerated by later writers is unclear. But the fact that it was believable says much about how death and entertainment were fused in the Roman psyche. In the slow quiet of night, you might imagine the arena now empty, its seats bathed in moonlight, the sand swept clean. Perhaps the ghosts of those condemned still wander beneath the stone arches, whispering stories no one remembers. You can almost hear the distant roar of the crowd, the growl of a lion, the soft flutter of a curtain rising. And then, stillness, again. Justice in Rome was not always about rehabilitation. It was about fear, control, display, order. Let that idea drift in your thoughts as you sink a little deeper into rest. The dust of the arena has settled. The torches have gone out. The crowd has gone home. Only silence remains, and the distant stars above a city that never truly slept. Let us drift now to the edge of the city, away from the arenas, away from the echo of applause and the roar of beasts. Follow the dusty roads that stretch outward from the heart of Rome, winding past fields, olive groves, and scattered villas. There, lining the roads like grim signposts, stood the reminders of Roman justice, tall, rough-hewn wooden crosses, silent, motionless, and yet filled with suffering, crucifixion, a punishment so cruel, so drawn out, and so humiliating that it has echoed across millennia. Though it was not invented by the Romans, they perfected it, refined it into a tool of fear, of dominance, of deliberate, prolonged pain. It was never meant to be quick. That was the point. Crucifixion was not a clean death. It was a message, a warning. It began long before the condemned ever reached the cross. The process often started with flagellation, a brutal scourging using whips embedded with bone, metal, or hooks. The skin was not just broken, it was torn, muscles exposed. Blood flowed freely, soaking the earth and the garments of the soldiers. Then came the procession. The condemned was forced to carry the horizontal beam of the cross, called the patibulum, through the streets. This was part humiliation, part exhaustion. Crowds gathered. People watched. Some jeered, others cried. Children pointed. And slowly the burdened figure stumbled onward. At the execution site, sometimes a hill, sometimes a roadside, the vertical post stood ready. The victim was laid down, or sometimes lifted by ropes. Nails were driven through the wrists, or the forearms, not the hands, as those would tear too easily. Another nail, or sometimes a set of them, pierced the feet. The pain was immediate, radiating, unrelenting. But death did not come quickly. Some victims lived for hours, some for days. Breathing became the true agony. To inhale, the condemned had to push themselves up, pressing against the nails in their feet and pulling on their arms. Each breath a choice between pain and suffocation. Eventually, the body gave out. Sometimes soldiers broke the legs to hasten death, preventing the person from pushing up at all. Sometimes they did not. In Rome, crucifixion was not for Roman citizens. It was for slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state. This distinction mattered deeply. A citizen could be beheaded, quick, clean, and respectable. But crucifixion was reserved for those whose death was meant to strip them of dignity. One of the most famous mass crucifixions occurred after the Spartacus rebellion in 71 BCE. When the slave revolt was finally crushed by Crassus, he ordered that 6,000 captured slaves be crucified along the Appian Way, the road from Rome to Capua. For nearly 200 kilometers, the road was lined with crosses. Every few steps, another figure. Every few breaths, another lesson in obedience. The message was clear. This is what happens when you challenge Rome. There was no burial. The bodies were left to rot in the sun, pecked by birds, gnawed by dogs, scorched by heat and cold. Over time, bones fell to the roadside. The smell lingered. Travelers passed, covering their mouths, casting glances, whispering prayers. And still, the empire moved on. You might imagine now, in the quiet of your room, the sun setting over a Roman hill, the silhouette of a cross standing against the sky, the faint clink of armor, the low murmur of soldiers setting camp nearby, a crow calling from a branch, the stillness of dust settling, and in that silence, a lingering sense of control, harsh, cold, absolute. The Romans did not use crucifixion lightly, but when they did, they made sure it would be remembered. It was a death that reached beyond the body. It attacked the identity. It erased honor. It reshaped memory. And so, we float back now, gently, away from the crosses, away from the scars of the punished and toward the slow, deep breath of sleep. Now we leave behind the harshness of the arena and the cross, and step into a quieter, but no less cruel corner of Roman justice. Not every punishment in the empire ended in death. In fact, many were carefully calibrated to preserve life, but to make that life harder, heavier, and more humiliating. These were punishments of the body, the name, the face. Punishments not meant to destroy, but to mark, to stain, to remind. Let us begin with exile. To be exiled in ancient Rome was not simply to be sent away. It was to be erased from your world. The Latin word for exile was exilium, and it could take many forms. There was relegatio, a milder version, temporary banishment, often from the city itself. But more severe was deportatio, a permanent sentence. A person sentenced to exile might be sent to a remote island or a distant province, somewhere beyond the familiar. Their property was often seized, their citizenship revoked, their family torn away, and perhaps worst of all, their name could be struck from public records. This act, called damnatio memoriae, was not common, but it was powerful. It meant erasing someone from memory itself, statues destroyed, inscriptions chiseled away, portraits painted over. Their image, their existence, systematically forgotten. To the Romans, to lose your name was to lose your place in the eternal city. It was a kind of second death, quiet, permanent, and inescapable. Other punishments were more visible. Facial. Branding was often used for slaves and criminals. The Latin term was stigma, a mark burned into the forehead, the cheek, or the arm. Sometimes it showed the crime committed, like a T for thief, or the initials of a master if the person was enslaved. Sometimes it simply meant property. Branded, these individuals could never hide what they were. In public, they were reminders, symbols of control. This practice was not just physical, it was psychological. Branding turned people into signs, into warnings, into living proof that law and punishment were never far away. Then there were public humiliations. A man might be stripped naked and paraded through the streets. Others might have their heads shaved, their clothes torn, or be forced to wear ridiculous outfits designed to mock their crimes. For some, their sentence was to stand in a public square, shackled, as insults and refuse were thrown by passers-by. Roman. Punishments were not always consistent. What one person received for a crime might differ wildly from another, depending on their status. A patrician, an elite Roman, might pay a fine. A plebeian, a commoner, might face public whipping. A slave might lose an ear or an eye, or worse. Justice was rarely blind in Rome. It wore a toga, and it looked at your birth. Sometimes the punishment was subtle. A woman caught in adultery might not be executed, but she could be stripped of her dowry, banished from her family, forbidden from remarrying. The law might not take her life, but it took her future. A disgraced senator might be allowed to live, but barred from speaking in the forum, from voting, from holding office. In the eyes of Rome, he became a ghost, alive, but silent, present, but powerless. There were even punishments involving forced labor, sentences to the mines, or to the construction of roads and aqueducts. These were brutal, endless labors. Many never returned. But it wasn't death. It was delayed death. Drawn out, stretched across days, months, and years. The Romans believed in hierarchy, in order, and their punishments reflected that belief. Every act of discipline was not only for the person receiving it, but for everyone watching. It reminded them where they stood and where they must never fall. Now, as we drift through these quieter punishments, you might imagine a man in exile, standing, alone on the edge of a rocky shore, staring across the sea toward a city he can never return to. Or a branded slave, moving through the market with eyes cast downward, the heat of the sun reflecting off the scar on their brow. Or a shamed noble, sitting in a garden, hearing the bustle of the city just beyond his walls, but unable to touch it. These were not punishments of blood, but they bled the soul. Quietly, slowly, let your thoughts settle now, like dust in the quiet corners of a Roman villa. The voices of the forum fade. The footsteps in the street grow distant. All that remains is the slow breath of time, and the gentle hush of history unfolding. We turn now from the city's streets, away from the senators, away from the magistrates and courts, and walk quietly through the columns of a Roman villa. The floor beneath us is smooth mosaic. The air is still, fragrant with oil and herbs. In this domestic world, the rules are different. The laws do not disappear, but here, they bend, shift, and take on new meanings. Justice is no longer a matter of trials and judges. Here, within these walls, the Father is the law. This concept was known as patria potestas, the power of the Father. In Roman culture, the father of the family, the paterfamilias, held legal authority over every member of his household, his wife, his children, his slaves, even in some cases his adult sons. He was the head, the judge, the ruler of his domain. And this power was vast. He could choose whom his children married. He could reject a newborn child and have it exposed, left outside to die, or be taken in by strangers. He could punish his family members, even to the point of death, though this was rare. More commonly, he could disown, disinherit, imprison. He was the law, written in flesh and blood. Consider a Roman boy caught stealing from the household purse. The matter would not go to court. His father might whip him, or confine him, or force him into labor. A daughter accused of impropriety could be locked away. A rebellious son might be banished to a rural estate for years. No formal record, no appeal. And then there were the slaves. Slaves in the Roman home were property, not people, at least not in the eyes of the law. A master could punish them however he wished. Whippings were routine, starvation, shackles, forced labor. Some were tattooed. Some were branded. In certain homes, punishment rooms existed, small dark spaces where slaves were locked for days. Some households even had slaves tasked with punishing other slaves, to keep order without exhausting the master's own energy. But cruelty was not always loud. It could be quiet, systematic. A slave who displeased his master might be forced to sleep standing up, forbidden from eating with others, made to wear humiliating clothes, or sold away from friends and family, sent far from the only world they had known. Still, some masters were kind. Some treated their slaves like trusted assistants, tutors, even companions. But under Roman law, kindness was optional. Authority was absolute. Within the Roman home, punishment was not just about correcting behavior. It was about preserving honor. A family's reputation was its most valuable possession. Any threat to it, real or imagined, could trigger discipline. Sometimes punishment was private. Sometimes it was theatrical. There are stories of fathers staging trials in their atriums, with relatives as witnesses, passing judgment on their own sons for drunkenness or dishonor. These were performances of morality, public statements. Even when the state remained silent, the family took on the role of enforcer. For women, the situation was delicate. A Roman woman, though not entirely without rights, lived under the authority of either her father or her husband. If accused of adultery or indiscretion, she could be divorced, banished, or worse. In some cases, her male relatives would convene to decide her fate, a gathering called a council of family. No lawyers, no jury, just blood and tradition. And yet, the home was also a place of order, of rhythm. Punishment was part of that rhythm, like sweeping the floors or lighting the lamps. It was woven into daily life. It shaped how children behaved, how slaves served, how wives navigated their roles. You might imagine it now, the hush of a Roman evening. The atrium lit by fading oil lamps. A father sitting in a carved wooden chair, his face shadowed, speaking quietly to a trembling son. Somewhere, a slave waits in silence. A mother listens behind a curtain. No shouting, just the slow, heavy weight of tradition pressing down on everyone. And outside, beyond the villa's stone walls, the city continues. The courts issue rulings. The forums echo with debate. But inside, the laws are older than books. They are written in memory, in custom, in silence. As you rest now, think of those quiet rooms, the flicker of lamplight on polished floors, the stillness of punishment not as cruelty, but as culture, not as justice, but as duty. We walk now beyond the stone walls of the city, past the gates and the farmland, toward the disciplined heart of Roman power, the legionary camp. Laid out with precision, each camp was a miniature city of tents, supply wagons, weapons, and soldiers. Everything in its place. Everything according to order. The Romans believed that military discipline, or disciplina militaris, was the foundation of their empire. Without it, legions would crumble. And so, to maintain it, the army enforced some of the most fearsome punishments known in the ancient world. The soldier's life was not easy, marching for days in full armor, digging trenches, building fortifications, training constantly. But above all this, what kept the army moving was the absolute certainty of consequence. The smallest infractions, falling asleep on watch, losing equipment, disobeying orders, could result in severe punishment. A soldier who deserted his post might be beaten to death by his comrades. A soldier who lied or stole might be flogged in front of the cohort. If the crime was grave enough, like mutiny or cowardice during battle, the consequences became even darker. One of the most infamous punishments in Roman military history was called decimation. From the Latin decem, meaning 10, decimation was used when an entire group of soldiers was found guilty of desertion, insubordination, or mass cowardice. The punishment did not fall evenly. Instead, soldiers were divided into groups of 10. Then, by drawing lots, one man in each group was chosen at random. That man was beaten to death by his 9 comrades. It was a punishment that was both symbolic and terrifying. The innocent could die. The guilty could survive. it wasn't just about punishing a crime. It was about breaking fear into the bones of every surviving soldier. To be forced to kill a fellow soldier, not in battle, but in punishment, that left a mark, deeper than any wound. There are accounts from Roman historians, like Suetonius and Plutarch, describing how decimation worked. The chosen men were often beaten with clubs, stones, or whips, not by officers, but by their own fellow soldiers. The act took time. There was no swift executioner. It was slow, brutal, exhausting. Afterward, the survivors might be given barley instead of wheat for rations, a signal of shame. Sometimes they were made to sleep outside the camp walls, exposed and unprotected, as a further reminder of their failure. And yet, Roman soldiers were expected not just to obey, they were expected to endure. Pain, hunger, loss, all of it. And so punishment became a part of life. It shaped them, hardened them. If a legion succeeded in battle, they might receive land, riches, honor. But if they faltered, they would face the harsh logic of military justice. There were other punishments, too, more personal, more precise. A soldier caught stealing from a comrade might be publicly whipped, his armor stripped away, his belt removed, a symbolic unmaking of his status as a soldier. A man who disrespected a superior might be struck in the face, not only to humiliate him, but to remind everyone who held power. For minor offenses, some soldiers were forced to stand all day with their arms extended holding weights. Others might be ordered to dig ditches for no reason, or to march in circles, or to carry extra burdens as a form of exhaustion punishment. And yet, for all the severity, the Roman army worked. Discipline held the legions together, hundreds of thousands of men, spread across continents, united by one chain of command. And punishment was the iron that kept that chain from snapping. Now, as you imagine the camp at night, the fires are low, the murmurs soft. The sentries stand at attention, their eyes heavy but unblinking. Somewhere in the dark, a soldier shifts in his blanket, remembering the punishment meted out that afternoon. He does not need to be reminded again. The stars above are cold. The ground is hard. And discipline, like the empire, endures. Let your breath slow now. Let your mind drift past the rigid lines of the camp, past the echo of commands, past the silent figures on watch. There, in the stillness, the rhythm of Roman, justice beats like a distant drum, constant, cold, and calculated. Power in ancient Rome was never secure. Behind every curtain, behind every gesture of respect, there might be a knife. The emperor was the most powerful man in the empire, but also the most endangered. The higher one rose, the further there was to fall. And when one fell, Rome made sure it was unforgettable. The Romans were deeply suspicious of treason, or maiestas, a crime not just against an individual, but against the state itself. Originally, the term referred to diminishing the majesty of the Roman people. But under the emperors, it came to mean one thing: offending the emperor's dignity. That could mean plotting to kill him, but it could also mean speaking ill of him, or writing a poem that made fun of him, or even failing to show the proper respect in public. And the punishments for this crime were not quick. They were not clean. They were designed to destroy not just the body, but the legacy. One of the most feared sentences was damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The victim would be led into an arena, unarmed and torn apart by wild animals, lions, leopards, bears. Sometimes, to prolong the suffering, the person would be wounded first, just enough to weaken them, not to kill. It wasn't just punishment. It was spectacle. Thousands watched, cheered, laughed. The death of a conspirator became entertainment, a reminder of what happened to those who challenged the imperial order. But some executions were quiet. Consider the story of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard, the elite force meant to protect the emperor. Sejanus grew powerful, ambitious, too powerful. When Emperor Tiberius finally turned on him, the fall was total. Sejanus was arrested in the Senate chamber, dragged through the streets, and executed, his body left for the mob to tear apart. But it didn't end there. His family was executed. His name was erased. His statues were toppled. The city itself was scrubbed of his memory. It wasn't just death. It was obliteration. Others were forced to die by suicide, a punishment disguised as mercy. Rather than face execution, a condemned senator or noble might be given a quiet chance to do the honorable thing. If he complied, his family might keep their wealth. If not, everything was seized. This was especially common under emperors like Nero or Domitian, who valued appearances. These deaths were staged like rituals. A bath was drawn. A servant brought wine. The condemned might write a final letter. Then, quietly, they would open their veins. In silence. In dignity, but always under watch. Then there were the theatrical executions, staged to mock and humiliate. Crucifixions, yes, but sometimes with variations. A man might be dressed as a mythological figure, say Icarus, and then thrown from a height, his wings failing him. Others might be made to reenact tragic tales, only to die at the end of the performance. In Nero's reign, some executions were designed as living dramas, where the criminal played the role of a doomed character. The line between art and execution blurred. The message was clear. Resist, and you won't just die. You'll be turned into a story, a warning, a performance etched into memory. Some were boiled alive, others burned slowly. There are stories, though rare, of men sealed into coffins or buried alive. Each punishment chosen not just for pain, but for meaning. Because in Rome, punishment was never just a response. It was a lesson. Even among friends, no one was safe. Political alliances shifted like sand. Today's confidant could be tomorrow's informant. A word overheard, a phrase written, a nod too sharp. These could all become evidence. And when a senator was led away in chains, the others would look down, silent, fearful, grateful it wasn't them. At night, in the palaces of the Palatine Hill, you could feel the tension. Servants spoke in whispers. Letters were burned. Eyes were everywhere. Power was a throne with knives underneath. Now, as you lie still, picture a candle flickering in a marble chamber, the whisper of sandals on cold stone. A sealed scroll arriving in the early hours of morning. A name read aloud in the Senate. The hush that follows. And then, nothing. Let your breath soften. Let the darkness wrap around you like a Roman cloak. The echoes of conspiracies fade, the arena's empty, the stories end, but the warning remains. Far from the Senate, far from the marble columns of the Forum, the Roman world continued, across mountains and deserts, through forests and plains. The empire stretched from Britannia in the cold, wet north to the sun-baked sands of Egypt, from the dense lands of Gaul to the bustling cities of Asia Minor. Each region had its own traditions, its own gods, its own sense of justice. But Rome brought its law everywhere it went. The provincial world was a place of contradictions. Roman soldiers patrolled cities built atop ancient sacred sites. Latin edicts were posted in towns where most people didn't speak the language. Governors were appointed to rule lands they had never seen before. And in this landscape, punishment was both familiar and foreign. Roman justice had to adapt, and in adapting, it often became even more elaborate. In some provinces, Roman officials allowed local elites to continue older forms of justice, so long as taxes were paid and rebellions suppressed. In Egypt, for example, where ancient traditions were deeply rooted. Judges might apply a mix of Roman law and native Egyptian practice. One man might be fined under Latin statutes. Another, for a similar crime, could be punished according to pharaonic customs still lingering in rural areas. In Judea, Roman governance often clashed with religious laws. For the local population, religious leaders still held great influence, and certain acts, like blasphemy or ritual impurity, might carry heavy spiritual consequences. But Rome cared only for political stability. The result was a fragile balance. Sometimes that balance broke. One of the most famous examples is the crucifixion of Jesus of Nazareth. To the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, Jesus was a potential political threat, someone stirring unrest. His execution was not only a punishment, but a message. Rome decides who lives and dies. The method, crucifixion, was reserved for the lowest, the most despised, the rebels and slaves. A public death, slow and humiliating. Crucifixion was common across the provinces. So were floggings, mutilations, and forced labor. Local populations often suffered more brutal treatment than Roman citizens. The protections of Roman law were not evenly distributed. A citizen could appeal to the emperor. A provincial farmer had no such luxury. In Gaul, early Roman rule coexisted with Druidic traditions, though the Druids were eventually suppressed, accused of human sacrifice and subversion. Traces of their customs lingered. Tales survive of rebels tied to trees or drowned in sacred lakes as both punishment and offering. Rome, seeing this, as barbarism, often responded with mass executions, sometimes crucifying entire villages after uprisings. In Britannia, punishment could be even more theatrical. After Boudicca's revolt in 60 CE, Roman forces responded with overwhelming force. Thousands were slaughtered. Survivors were enslaved. Captives were paraded through cities, sometimes naked and bound, as reminders of Roman vengeance. Towns that had resisted Rome were burned or rebuilt in Roman fashion, stone by stone, law by law. In the eastern provinces, where Greek culture had mingled with Rome's power, punishment could be more refined, but no less cruel. Accused conspirators in cities like Antioch or Ephesus might be exiled to remote islands, far from civilization. Philosophers who spoke too freely could find themselves under house arrest, their schools shut down, their students scattered, and then there were the mines. Throughout the provinces, criminals, especially non-citizens, were sometimes sentenced to damnatio ad metalla, condemnation to the mines. These were not ordinary prisons. They were living tombs. In the silver mines of Spain or the sulfur pits of Sicily, men and women worked until death, shackled, starved, often beaten. The air was toxic, the tunnels claustrophobic. A sentence to the mines was a sentence to vanish. No grave, no return. Even in provinces that saw peace, Roman justice was never subtle. Tax evaders could be branded on the face. Rebels might have their tongues cut out. A village that resisted conscription might be fined, its leaders flogged. In the town square, justice was not blind. It was deliberate, visible, meant to cast a shadow over every street and every field. Still, in some corners, resistance simmered. Secret rites were held. Stories were passed down. And though Roman law claimed to be universal, local memories ran deep. Now, imagine a quiet provincial town, nestled in the hills of Asia Minor. The market is closed. The sky turns violet at dusk. A local priest whispers a prayer in a language older than Latin. A Roman official watches from a balcony, scroll in hand. Somewhere, a prisoner is marched through the square, silent, resigned. The people watch, but they do not speak, and the empire watches them all. Let your thoughts drift now, across mountain paths and quiet rivers, across borderlands where justice wears different faces, where Rome is both a ruler and a stranger, where punishment is not just law but language, a language of fear, a language of power. In the Roman world, to live meant more than to breathe. It meant to belong, to be seen, heard, honored. Reputation was everything. A good name could open every door. A bad one could close them all. And so, some of the cruelest punishments Rome invented did not draw blood. They drew silence. One of the most devastating penalties a Roman could face was exile. Known as exilium, it came in different forms, some voluntary, some forced, some temporary, and some forever. Imagine this. You are a senator accused of a crime. The emperor offers you a choice: face trial, where the outcome is uncertain, or leave the city quietly, your name intact but your life in Rome over. Many took the second path. They retreated to distant estates, islands, or towns at the edge of the empire. Alive, yes, but removed, forgotten. And that was the punishment. Not to die, but to vanish. No more Senate debates, no more dinners, no more theater or acclaim. You became a ghost, exiled from the center of the world. Some were exiled to remote islands such as Gyaros or Patmos, rocky, wind-beaten places with little water, little food, and less comfort. These were not paradises. They were prisons made of sea and distance. Others faced interdictio aquae et ignis, banishment from Roman territory under penalty of death. It meant you were denied the basics of survival: water and fire. A symbolic gesture, yes, but one that declared you no longer part of the human community. Anyone who offered you help could be punished themselves. But worse still was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was not an official punishment at first, but over time, it became one of Rome's darkest tools. When someone fell, deeply out of favor, usually a powerful figure, an emperor, a general, a traitor, the Senate might vote to erase their memory. Their name was removed from inscriptions. Their statues were smashed or recarved. Portraits were burned. Coins were melted. Scrolls were edited. It was as if they had never existed. It was a strange kind of execution, a murder of the past. We can still see the scars today. In museums, you'll find busts with the faces chiseled off, plaques where letters have been violently scratched away. These were not accidents. They were acts of political violence, done in marble and bronze. To be forgotten was worse than death. Romans believed in legacy, in fama, the fame that lived after you. To be erased was to die twice. Even small infractions could bring social death. A senator caught cheating in a public contract might be expelled from the Senate. A citizen found guilty of certain crimes might lose their civitas, the rights of citizenship. They might still live in Rome, but no one would speak to them. They could not vote. They could not marry legally. They became invisible in their own city. Some were marked permanently. A slave who tried to escape might be branded on the forehead with the letters fug, short for fugitivus, fugitive. It was not just a punishment. It was a label, a warning to others, a lifelong shame. Even within the home, disgrace could strike. A father in Roman law had the power to disown his child, to cast them out from the family name. A husband could divorce his wife with public accusations. A man's household could fall like a tower, with one scandal, one mistake. And yet, there was no blood in these punishments, no arena, no executioner's blade, just silence, just withdrawal, just absence. Imagine now a once great man walking the streets of Rome. He wears fine robes, but no one greets him. Children are pulled away. Doors close before him. His name is not spoken. His house lies empty. His statue has been removed. His words erased from the records. He is alive, and utterly alone. In a world that prized memory, honor, and legacy, to be forgotten was to lose everything. Let your breath slow. Let your eyes grow heavy. Picture the dim halls of a Roman villa, dust gathering where laughter once echoed. A scroll lies half burned, a name half vanished. No footsteps approach. No voice calls out. Only the quiet weight of erasure. To understand Roman justice, one must understand that law was never separate from religion. The gods were watching, always, and when someone committed a crime, especially a serious one, it wasn't just an offense against the state or another person. It was an offense against the divine order. Rome's laws were believed to echo the will of the gods. The earliest legal code, the 12 Tables, was said to have been given to the Romans after much deliberation, almost like receiving scripture. Legal oaths were sworn in the names of deities. Court sessions began with religious rituals, and temples served not only as houses of worship, but as repositories of legal records and sacred contracts. In this world, justice wasn't just justice, it was ritual. Some punishments were explicitly religious acts. For instance, certain criminals could be devoted to the gods, a process known as devotio. This was more than an execution. It was a form of human sacrifice, though not in the way we think of ancient altars and daggers. A person might be declared sacer, accursed, sacred to the gods. This person could then be killed by anyone, and no punishment would follow. In fact, to kill someone, sacer was a form of religious duty. One who became sacer existed in a terrible in-between state, still living, but already spiritually marked for death. Sacred spaces could also serve as stages of punishment. Temples were usually off-limits for violence, but violating one could bring punishment both legal and divine. To steal from a temple or harm a priest was to risk being executed in the temple square, under the gaze of the gods. Sometimes offenders were made to offer humiliating sacrifices or parade through the streets in religious dress before facing their sentence. Some crimes required ritual cleansing, even before punishment. A polluted soul, someone who had murdered, within a sacred boundary or touched a taboo object, might be banished or whipped in a public rite designed to drive out the impurity. These ceremonies blurred the lines between law and magic, and then there were the omens. If a lightning strike hit the forum, or a bird flew in the wrong direction before a trial, the proceedings could be delayed, or even nullified. The augurs, Rome's official interpreters of divine signs, held immense sway. A man might escape punishment because a chicken refused to eat. Another might be condemned because a priest saw a comet. This was not superstition. It was cosmic order. During times of public unrest, the Senate might declare a sacred fast or a lustratio, a ritual cleansing of the city. Criminals were punished with great ceremony. Processions wound through the streets. Prayers were recited, sacrifices made, all to restore balance between the human world and the gods above. One of the strangest punishments involving ritual came during the festival of Lupercalia. As part of the ceremony, young priests, called luperci, ran through the streets, striking women with strips of goat hide. It was not a punishment per se, but it was meant to cleanse sin, increase fertility, and protect against misfortune. It was one of many ways the Romans blurred the line between religious act and civic duty, but perhaps the most chilling use of religion in punishment came during times of crisis. When disasters struck, plagues, famines, defeats in war, the Romans sometimes believed that a sacrilegious crime had gone unpunished. In response, the state might carry out expiatory executions. An innocent man could be chosen as a scapegoat, ritually condemned to appease the gods. In one version of the ritual, this man was dressed in holy garments, paraded through the city, then driven out, beaten, mocked, or even killed at the edge of town. The goal was not justice, but divine favor. In extreme cases, entire groups were punished religiously. After slave revolts or cult conspiracies, executions might be held within sacred boundaries, with special rites to purify the area afterward. This was especially common when the crime was linked to foreign religions, mystery cults, secret rites, anything that felt un-Roman. Even the death of an emperor could take on a ritual form. Some emperors were declared gods after death, divus, and those who had opposed them might find themselves posthumously accused of sacrilege. Punishment followed not only in life, but in memory. Now, close your eyes. Imagine the flickering torches in a temple courtyard, the heavy scent of incense, a priest murmuring words older than any scroll, a man kneeling before an altar, knowing that his sentence is not just from man, but from something eternal. A bell rings in the distance. The crowd watches in silence. Not all punishments bleed. Let your thoughts drift now, like smoke rising from an offering bowl. Let the rhythm of ceremony wrap around you. Law, ritual, silence. Rome did not simply punish the body, it punished the soul. Roman justice prided itself on its laws. The lex, written down and codified, was meant to be clear, rational, universal. But in practice, who you were shaped what justice meant for you. Let's begin with children. Under Roman law, a child was considered part of the father's potestas, his legal power. He had the right to discipline his children, and even in early Rome, to kill them. That absolute authority would later be curbed. But for most of Roman history, a father could decide his child's fate without needing a public trial. Corporal punishment at home was common. Whippings, confinement, denial of food. These were not abuses, but responsibilities of Roman fatherhood. If a child committed a crime, especially one that brought public shame, the punishment was often applied to the father too. In some cases, the state would demand that the father punish the child himself. Refusal to do so could result in loss of citizenship or property. Boys over the age of 14 were legally accountable as men, but courts could still show mercy for their youth. A teenage thief might be flogged instead of executed. A young conspirator might be exiled instead of crucified. Age mattered, but it didn't protect you from pain. Now turn your thoughts to Roman women. Women in Rome lived under layers of guardianship: father, husband, even adult sons. They could not vote, they could not hold office, but they could still be punished, and often more severely for stepping out of bounds. For example, adultery was a public crime for a married woman, not a private matter. The Emperor Augustus introduced strict laws to punish unfaithful wives. A husband who failed to report his wife's adultery could himself be punished. If found guilty, the woman might be exiled to a barren island, her property seized, her dowry lost. But male adultery? Technically not illegal, unless it involved another citizen's wife. If a woman was convicted of poisoning, infanticide, or treason, her punishments were often public and theatrical. She might be paraded through the forum, shaved bald, her clothes torn. The goal was not only punishment, but humiliation. Some women were sewn into sacks, others were drowned or strangled, and yet others were buried alive, especially Vestal, virgins who broke their vow of chastity. These sacred priestesses were the guardians of Rome's eternal flame. If they violated their vows, they were not merely punished. They were sealed into underground tombs, left with a small lamp and a little food, and left to die. This was not only justice, it was ritual death, a warning to all of Rome. Now consider the slaves, the bottom of Roman society. A slave had no legal personhood. They could be bought, sold, branded, or killed by their master. Their testimony in court was only accepted under torture. They were property, not people. And so, punishments for slaves were brutal, and routine. A minor mistake could bring lashes. A disrespectful word could lead to shackling or starvation. Attempted escape? Branding on the forehead. The letters fug, fugitivus, burned into their skin. Some were forced to wear metal collars engraved with warnings. I am a runaway. Return. Me to my master. If a slave killed their master, the law was horrifyingly clear. All slaves in the household were to be executed, regardless of their involvement. There is a recorded case of over 400 slaves being killed because one of them murdered a nobleman. Runaway slaves were hunted like animals. Professional slave catchers roamed the cities and roads, dragging fugitives back in chains. Punishment could include crucifixion, one of the most degrading forms of death imaginable, reserved especially for the lowborn. And yet the system had its contradictions. A freed slave, a libertus, could rise in status, even become wealthy. But a citizen who committed a grave crime could be reduced to slavery as punishment. Status, then, was not just a shield, it could be taken from you. Roman citizens, even the poor ones, could not legally be whipped without a trial. But once their rights were stripped, through conviction, exile, or dishonor, they could be punished like any slave. One's rank shaped the nature of punishment. A senator condemned for treason might be allowed to die in exile, or quietly take his own life. But a plebeian in the same situation, he might face public execution. Wealth also mattered. A rich man could afford a skilled advocate. He could bribe officials, delay trials, even purchase lighter penalties. The poor, meanwhile, had few allies. For them, justice often came quickly, and without mercy. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. Roman justice was not blind. It saw your age, your gender, your wealth, your ancestry. It measured your body. It weighed your name. And it punished accordingly. Now breathe deep. Let your eyes soften. Picture a crowded Roman street, a senator passing in a gilded litter, a beggar clutching bread, a young boy chased by a tutor, a woman avoiding the eyes of her accuser, a slave limping under heavy chains. All of them Roman, all of them subject to justice, but each in a different language of pain. Far from the marble columns of the Roman Forum, where senators argued and laws were written, lay a different kind of Rome. It was the Rome of garrisons and governors, of remote outposts and dusty roads, of conquered peoples learning to live under the rule of a foreign empire. In these far-flung provinces, Roman justice arrived not as parchment and procedure, but as swords and symbols. The Roman provinces were sprawling: Gaul and Hispania, Judea and Egypt, Britannia, Numidia, Syria. In each of these lands, local traditions met Roman law, and the result was often unpredictable. At first, Rome allowed a degree of legal autonomy in the provinces. Local laws could remain in use, especially in cities that had allied with Rome. Tribal elders and local magistrates might still hear cases, but when a Roman interest was involved, especially taxes, loyalty, or public order, imperial justice took over, and it came with force. A Roman governor had sweeping powers. Known as a proconsul or propraetor, he acted as both judge and executioner. He could summon trials, demand evidence, pronounce sentence, all without appeal. In remote regions, his word was law, and sometimes that law was bloodied by cruelty. Take, for instance, the use of summary punishment. In the provinces, suspected rebels, thieves, or dissenters might be executed without trial. Flogging, branding, and crucifixion were common tools. Whole villages could be punished for harboring bandits or failing to pay tribute. Roman justice was swift and designed to intimidate. Roman soldiers stationed in the provinces also exercised justice informally. Military camps became microcosms of Roman power. A soldier might be punished for desertion by death. A local who insulted a centurion might be beaten or enslaved. There were rules, technically, but in the provinces, enforcement often meant improvisation. In some cases, Roman justice adapted to local customs in deeply unsettling ways. In Egypt, for example, ancient traditions of ritual punishment continued under Roman rule, but were now reframed as imperial justice. A thief might be buried alive in a sandpit, his crime announced in both Latin and Demotic script. In Judea, where religious tensions ran high, Roman officials sometimes used crucifixion as a public message, not just against crime, but against insurrection. This blending of legal cultures created strange hybrids. Roman punishment, local superstition, imperial arrogance, all mixed into an unpredictable system. What was mercy in Rome might be cruelty in Gaul. What was justice in Africa might be blasphemy in Syria. Sometimes local leaders were forced to participate in Roman executions, especially when Rome wanted to project power through native elites. Tribal kings, temple priests, and city magistrates would pronounce sentence on behalf of the empire. Their own people might view them as collaborators, but they were trapped between resistance and survival. In Britannia, Roman justice was particularly harsh after revolts. When Queen Boudica led an uprising against Roman rule in 60 CE, the Roman response was ferocious. Entire villages were razed. Survivors were enslaved. Tribal leaders were tortured or executed in public squares. The message was clear. Rebellion would be met with absolute destruction. But not all provincial punishment was born from rage. Some of it was coldly administrative. Census officials traveled through the provinces, documenting populations, assessing taxes. Those who lied on census forms, avoided taxes, or fled their land assignments could face flogging, imprisonment, or enslavement. In some cases, their families would be punished as well. Even paperwork under Roman rule could kill. One of the darkest tools of Roman punishment in the provinces was deportatio ad metalla, deportation to the mines. Criminals, slaves, and political prisoners could be sent to labor in the gold, silver, and lead mines of Spain, Egypt, and Dacia. Conditions were horrific. Life expectancy was short. Punishment by mining was effectively a slow execution. Inscriptions left behind by those sentenced to the mines speak of pain, silence, and dust. One fragment reads simply, "Here I die every day. Rome remembers me, not." Religion also played a role in provincial justice. Roman officials were wary of foreign cults, especially those that met in secret. In some parts of the empire, followers of early Christianity, or Bacchic mystery cults, were arrested, tortured, and executed. Their faith was seen as subversive. Punishing them became an act of both law and loyalty. Crucifixion, though used sparingly, in Rome itself, was used widely in the provinces, particularly for non-citizens. The hill outside Jerusalem where Jesus was crucified was just one of many places where Rome displayed its authority through public execution. And yet, amidst all this, there were moments of grace. Some provincial governors were wise and restrained. Some local communities flourished under Roman rule and benefited from Roman law. The roads, the aqueducts, the grain shipments, all were part of the same empire that administered lashings and crucifixions. Justice in the provinces was not only a matter of punishment, it was a matter of control, and in that control was fear. Now, as you lie back and imagine the dusty road stretching out from the heart of Rome, picture the signs in Latin, the guards, in polished armor, the local elders kneeling before an imperial desk. A child watches from behind a stone wall as a thief is led away in chains. A governor signs a scroll. A soldier tightens a rope. A priest mutters a prayer. The empire moves forward. The law is carried on boots and blood. And you? You are just a traveler, eyes closed, drifting on the sound of a world built on order, enforced by pain. Imagine this. A hot afternoon, the sun baking white marble. The crowd roars like a living beast. You're sitting on a stone bench, shoulder to shoulder with thousands of others. Beneath you, the sand of the arena glows gold. Somewhere below, behind the iron gates, someone is waiting to die. This was not an execution. This was a show. In ancient Rome, public punishment often took the form of entertainment, particularly during games held in amphitheaters across the empire. The most famous was, of course, the Colosseum in Rome. But arenas existed in Carthage, in Gaul, in the provinces as far as Britain. Wherever Romans went, they brought with them not just law and order, but blood and applause. The word for these public shows was munera, meaning duties or gifts. Rich men, emperors, and magistrates would sponsor games to gain political favor or celebrate military victories. These events might include gladiatorial combat, wild animal hunts, and in between, executions. Not just any executions, but carefully. Staged deaths designed for maximum drama. One such form was known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It sounds simple. Criminals, slaves, or enemies of the state were thrown to wild animals. But it was rarely so quick. The condemned might be made to act out a myth before their death. A man portraying the god Prometheus might be chained and have his liver torn by vultures. Another, dressed as Orpheus, might be surrounded by trained animals until a hidden gate opened and the real predators emerged. These were not just punishments. They were narratives, executions with storylines. Deaths turned into morality plays, where the criminal always met divine or poetic justice, often with the audience cheering as the final blow landed. Crucifixion could also be part of the games, especially if time allowed for a slow display. Sometimes victims were crucified upside down. Sometimes they were set on fire, or left to die over days as the crowd came and went. This public suffering was meant to terrify the living and satisfy the crowd's thirst for order. There was also a punishment called the tunic of flame. A condemned person was placed in a flammable garment, often soaked in pitch, and set alight during the evening shows. This was especially used during the reign of Emperor Nero, who reportedly lit his gardens with burning bodies. In some cases, criminals were forced to fight each other, untrained, terrified, armed with wooden swords or broken tools. Their deaths were clumsy, pathetic, slow. The crowd found it amusing. Laughter at incompetence was as much a part of Roman punishment as horror at suffering. Some sentences included a cruel form of deception. The condemned would be told they were being spared, only to be led to a new chamber, chained, and executed there. Mercy turned out to be another form of cruelty. Not all executions were violent. Some were theatrical in their silence. Take them, case of burial alive, reserved for Vestal virgins who broke their vow of chastity. They were dressed in funeral robes, led through the streets in a silent procession, and lowered into a sealed underground chamber with a lamp, a bit of food, and water. The door was bricked up behind them. The audience stood in silence. A sacred death, solemn and slow. There was ritual even in mutilation. Thieves might have their hands chopped off in front of the public. Falsifiers of coins might be branded on the forehead. Those who falsely claimed Roman citizenship could have their tongues torn out. The more symbolic the crime, the more symbolic the punishment. Sometimes, animals were part of the execution, not just as killers, but as props. A man who betrayed Rome might be dressed in animal skins and hunted like prey. Others might be tied to chariots and dragged through the sand until their bodies broke apart. There were moments of grim creativity. Executioners developed elaborate machines for death, rotating wheels, seesaws that dropped the condemned into spikes, trapdoors above, pits of wild animals. It wasn't just about ending life. It was about shaping memory. The Romans understood that punishment, when performed well, left a deeper scar on the soul of society. Even Roman poets and writers, often so reserved, documented these events. Seneca, watching a midday execution show, wrote that it was pure butchery. But the people loved it. Juvenal, the satirist, joked that Romans only needed two things: bread and circuses. Executions were part of that circus, and yet, there were those who wept. Not everyone cheered. Some turned their faces away. Some left early. Some wrote letters of protest. Even in Rome, not all hearts were hardened, but the system endured, because spectacle worked. The man dying in the sand did more than bleed. He reminded the crowd that order must be kept, that crime has consequence, that Rome's power is absolute. No judge could command such awe. No courtroom could summon such fear. And now, as you lie back and listen, imagine the crowd quieting. The gate creaks. The condemned man steps into the arena. His feet are bare. His hands tremble. A lion roars from the shadows. A trumpet sounds. He looks to the sky, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in regret. The gate slams shut behind him. No words are spoken, only the sand remembers. As the sand in the arena is swept clean and the crowd returns to their daily lives, we step into quieter spaces. A dimly lit library, a scholar's study, a magistrate's chamber. Here, parchment rustles instead of chains. Pens scratch instead of whips cracking. It is in these places that Roman justice was thought out, argued, and codified. To understand the bizarre punishments of ancient Rome, one must understand the Roman mindset. The punishments were not random. They were, in many cases, the result of deep cultural beliefs about order, power, honor, and fear. The Roman Republic and later the Empire held virtues, a concept of manly excellence, and disciplina, a strict sense of social order, in the highest regard. Society depended on stability, hierarchy, and duty. Crime, therefore, was not just a personal failing, it was an affront to Roman identity. And punishment was the corrective force. The earliest Roman legal system, the 12 Tables, set the tone. These laws were engraved on bronze in the 5th century BCE and placed in the Roman Forum for all to see. They were clear, public, and harsh. They included provisions for death, mutilation, exile, and enslavement. Their simplicity was both their strength and their cruelty. But Roman thinkers and writers debated what punishment should mean. The Stoic philosophers, like Seneca and Marcus, Aurelius believed in reason, virtue, and restraint. Seneca, for instance, condemned the use of excessive violence. He saw public executions as degrading not only for the condemned but for those watching. He wrote, "What is the need to punish with cruelty when the goal is correction?" And yet, he lived in an empire where men were burned alive for amusement. This contradiction ran deep. Roman justice was not about rehabilitation. It was about deterrence. To prevent crime, one had to make crime unthinkable. And so, punishments had to be visible, memorable, and often symbolic. Stealing a loaf of bread might be punished with flogging, but stealing from the state could lead to execution. This wasn't because one crime was bloodier. It was because Rome saw itself as sacred. The empire was a body, and crimes against it were like disease. Justice, then, was surgery. Legal thinkers such as Ulpian and Papinian, who helped compile and refine Roman law, argued for proportional punishment. They believed that punishment should match the crime, not just in severity, but in type. For example, a forger might be branded on the face because he had lied with his identity. A traitor might be strangled quietly to deny him the honor of a public death. A soldier who deserted might be executed in front of his legion as a lesson to all. Honor was crucial. Roman citizens had different punishments than slaves or foreigners. A Roman citizen could not be crucified, at least in theory. Instead, he might be beheaded or exiled. Slaves, however, could be tortured, crucified, or thrown to the beast without trial. This legal divide wasn't just about class, it was about the idea of Romanness itself. The philosopher Cicero, writing during the waning days of the Republic, defended Roman law as a reflection of divine order. He believed justice came from natural law, and that the Republic had a duty to uphold it. Yet even Cicero endorsed execution for enemies of the state. In his speeches, he argued for the killing of conspirators without trial. Rome's survival, he said, was above law. This thinking paved the way for imperial power. Under emperors like Augustus, Tiberius, and Domitian, punishment became not just a tool of justice, but a tool of fear. The emperor himself became the living embodiment of law. Disloyalty to him was disloyalty to Rome, and thus a capital crime. Philosophers under imperial rule often walked a dangerous line. They could advise moderation, but only if it did not appear as criticism of the emperor. Some, like Seneca, managed this balance. Others, like Musonius Rufus, were exiled. Even emperors, at times, reflected on justice. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, wrote in his Meditations about the need for mercy and discipline. He believed punishment should be just, and that rage had no place in the courtroom. Yet during his reign, Christians were executed, and revolts crushed with Roman efficiency. Justice, it seemed, was always at war with politics. Rome's legal tradition continued to evolve. By the 3rd century CE, law codes were more complex, with clearer categories of crimes and punishments. Legal scholars debated the limits of torture, the meaning of citizenship, and the power of the state. Yet, even as theory advanced, the practice of punishment remained brutal. Because punishment in Rome wasn't just about laws, it was about control. It was about reminding every subject, every slave, every senator, that Rome ruled not only the land, but the body. That law was not an abstraction. It was a blade. Now, as you lie quietly and think of scrolls, togas, and marble halls, imagine the silence of a courtroom at dawn. The magistrate lifts his stylus. A name is etched on a wax tablet. A sentence is whispered. Outside, a prisoner waits. The law has spoken, and the world continues, as if nothing changed. Time moves forward. Statues wear away. Emperors come and go, and Rome changes. By the early 4th century CE, the once pagan Roman Empire had begun to transform. What had started as a persecuted sect of humble believers slowly became the official religion of the state. In the year 313, the Edict of Milan, signed by Emperor Constantine, granted freedom of worship to Christians. And not long after, Christianity was favored, then dominant, and eventually enforced. This religious revolution had profound effects, not just on temples and theology, but on law and punishment. Yet the story is not a simple one. It is not the story of cruelty giving way to kindness. Instead, it is a story of new justifications for old methods, of new values applied with the same cold instruments. Let us begin with the Christian view of suffering. To early Christians, suffering was not merely punishment, it was redemption. Pain could cleanse the soul. Martyrdom was a path to holiness. The image of Christ, whipped, mocked, crucified, became a powerful symbol of noble suffering. This view did not eliminate violence. In some ways, it sacralized it. In the early days, Christians were often on the receiving end of Roman punishment. They were arrested, tortured, and executed for refusing to worship the emperor or Roman gods. Many were crucified, burned alive, or thrown to wild beasts. Their deaths were meant to humiliate, but to Christian communities, these martyrs became saints, their stories told and retold. But when Christianity became the empire's dominant religion, the roles reversed. The persecuted now held the power of law, and with that power, they reshaped Roman punishment, not to make it gentler necessarily, but to make it theologically correct. Certain public spectacles faded. Gladiatorial combat, for instance, became less acceptable as Christian values took hold. In the year 404, after a monk named Telemachus rushed into the arena to stop a fight and was killed by the crowd, Emperor Honorius banned gladiator games in Rome. The empire was already weakening, and the appetite for blood sport waned, yet public executions continued. Torture continued. Crucifixion, though eventually abandoned, was replaced with other forms of execution, like beheading, hanging, or burning. What changed was language and motivation. Punishment was no longer about Roman honor. It was about divine justice. Laws were written to reflect Christian morality. Heresy became a crime. Blasphemy, apostasy, and sorcery joined the list of offenses that could lead to death. The body was still punished, but now the soul was judged too. Under Christian emperors like Theodosius, the law books began to include not only civil and criminal codes, but religious mandates. Churches gained legal authority. Bishops could intercede on behalf of criminals. Sometimes they succeeded in softening punishments. Other times, they called for harsher ones. There was also a shift in the use of penance. Instead of mutilation or exile, some offenders were sentenced to long years of prayer, fasting, and isolation. Monasteries became places not just of devotion, but of punishment. A thief might be confined to a cell with bread and water. A wayward priest might be silenced with vows of poverty and obedience. But this softer form of punishment did not replace the harsher one. It existed alongside it. The poor and enslaved were still flogged. Rebels were still executed. The state still needed order, and the sword remained a tool of justice. The idea of hell, with its burning torment and eternal chains, provided a divine mirror for earthly punishments. If God could sentence souls to eternal pain, then surely the state could punish bodies in time. Even the architecture of punishment changed. Roman prisons, once simple holding cells before trial, grew into more complex institutions. Dungeons, oubliettes, places of darkness and silence. In Christian Rome, prisoners were expected not only to suffer, but to repent. There were also new rituals around punishment. Executions might be preceded by prayers or blessings. Criminals might confess before death, hoping to cleanse their souls. The executioner's blade was now seen not just as a tool of law, but as an instrument of God. It was during this period that the idea of divine justice truly merged with imperial power. The emperor was still the highest authority on earth, but now he ruled as God's chosen. Law was not just Roman, it was holy. The punishment of heretics became especially cruel. Those who taught false doctrine, or who refused Christian sacraments, could be imprisoned, tortured, or executed. These were not crimes of theft or violence, but of belief. And so began a long tradition in European history of religious punishment, where what you believed could cost you your life. By the 5th century, Rome itself had begun to fall. Barbarian tribes invaded. The Western Empire crumbled, but the legal culture of punishment lived on, in the Eastern Roman Empire, known as Byzantium, and in the Church itself. Roman ideas about justice, crime, and punishment, blended with Christian theology, would shape the laws of medieval Europe, the codes of kings and popes, and even modern notions of state power. As you rest now, think of a Roman judge, his robes darker than marble, his pen hovering over a wax tablet. Behind him, a crucifix hangs. Before him, a trembling figure waits. The punishment is written, the sentence is passed, and somewhere outside a bell rings, not for death, but for penance. As the dust of the Roman Empire settled, and new kingdoms rose from its ruins, the echoes of Roman justice lingered on. The empire may have fallen, but its ideas about punishment, brutal, symbolic, and theatrical, continued to influence generations. Medieval. Europe inherited much from Rome's legal and penal systems. The concept that crime was an offense not just against a victim but against the social order itself remained central. Punishments were still meant to be public, to warn, to control. Medieval courts often echoed Roman procedures: trials by ordeal or combat, harsh corporal punishments, public executions. The idea that justice was a spectacle, a performance that reassured the community, remained strong. Crucifixion was gone, but hanging, burning at the stake, and breaking on the wheel carried on the Roman flair for dramatic punishment. The wheel, in particular, is believed to have roots in Roman execution devices. In castles, town squares, and marketplaces, executions attracted crowds just as they had in the arenas of Rome. The public shaming of criminals, through stocks, pillories, or branding, continued the Roman tradition of making punishment visible and symbolic. Yet, alongside cruelty, Christian influence introduced new ideas of mercy and redemption. Monasteries offered sanctuary, and confessions became part of justice. But the line between penance and punishment often blurred. Rulers of medieval kingdoms also adopted Roman legal codes, such as the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Emperor Justinian, which survived in the Byzantine Empire and later influenced Western law. This Roman legal heritage shaped the development of canon law, the Church's own system of justice, and secular laws in kingdoms like France, England, and the Holy Roman Empire. Even the instruments of punishment, chains, whips, swords, bore designs inspired by Roman craftsmanship. Executioners sometimes wore robes reminiscent of Roman magistrates, maintaining the theater of power. As time marched toward the Renaissance, growing literacy and legal scholarship led to more codified laws, but the dramatic public punishments persisted well into the early modern period. Only in recent centuries, with the rise of ideas about human rights, due process, and rehabilitation, did the harshest Roman-inspired punishments begin to fade. Still, the Roman legacy remains. The idea that punishment must be public, proportional, and symbolic continues to influence criminal justice systems worldwide. Our modern prisons, courtrooms, and even media coverage of crime owe something to the ancient arenas. So, as you drift into sleep, imagine standing in a medieval square, watching a public trial under torches. The crowd murmurs as the judge reads the sentence, echoes of Rome ringing in every word. As we move deeper into the shadows of history, certain punishments stand out, not just for their cruelty, but for their longevity. These brutal methods, born in the arenas and courts of Rome, found new life in later ages, evolving but never disappearing entirely. One of the most notorious was crucifixion. While abolished in the later Roman Empire, it left a powerful mark. The method itself, nailing or binding a person to a wooden cross and leaving them to die slowly, was designed for maximum suffering and public humiliation. It was reserved for slaves, rebels, and the lowest criminals. The image of crucifixion became central to Christian theology with the death of Jesus Christ, forever linking this punishment with sacrifice and redemption. Although crucifixion ceased, as a legal practice, its symbolic power endured. Some later regimes and rebels would imitate it as a form of terror. The concept of public, slow death by exposure persisted. Another gruesome punishment that traveled through time was decimation, a Roman military disciplinary method where every 10th soldier in a rebellious or cowardly unit was executed by his comrades. This brutal act aimed to restore discipline through fear and solidarity. Though decimation itself was rare and extreme, the idea of collective punishment echoed in medieval and modern military justice. Damnatio ad bestias, or being thrown to wild beasts, was a spectacle that horrified and fascinated Roman crowds. Lions, bears, and other animals were used to execute criminals and prisoners. This brutal form of entertainment faded after the gladiatorial games declined, but inspired later practices of animal executions, or symbolic judgment by beasts, in folklore. Mutilation was another common Roman punishment, often applied to slaves and non-citizens. Cutting off a hand, tongue, or nose was a way to mark criminals permanently and shame them visibly. This practice influenced medieval punishments like branding and amputation, which continued to be used to control populations and deter crime. The use of whipping or flogging was widespread in Rome for lesser crimes and discipline. This form of corporal punishment survived in various forms across centuries, often as a preliminary or public humiliation before harsher sentences. Roman execution by burning alive was reserved for certain crimes such as arson or treason, while abhorrent burning persisted through medieval Europe, often used for heretics, witches, and traitors. Finally, Roman exile, banishing criminals to distant provinces or islands, was a punishment that combined removal from society with loss of status. Exile became a favored tool for emperors to silence political rivals without bloodshed, and the idea lived on through medieval and early modern banishments. These punishments reflect the Roman blend of justice and spectacle, control and message, pain and theater. As you lie quietly, think of the condemned awaiting fate in a Roman arena, the crowd silent but expectant. The executioner raises his sword. The ancient ritual unfolds, a grim reminder that justice has always been a story told, with power, pain, and meaning. Punishment in ancient Rome was more than just a legal act. It was a powerful psychological force that shaped the minds and emotions of everyone involved. For the victims, the experience was terrifying and often dehumanizing. Facing a brutal execution or torture was not only physical agony, but also mental torment. The knowledge that their suffering was meant to be seen, to serve as a warning, added a layer of humiliation. Many victims faced their fate with resignation, some with defiance, others with despair. Public punishments created a complex atmosphere for spectators. Crowds in the arenas and forums were both voyeurs and participants. For some, watching executions was a form of entertainment, a release of social tensions. For others, it was a grim reminder of the fragility of life and the power of the state. The collective witnessing of punishment reinforced social norms and hierarchies. It reminded citizens of their place within the vast machinery of the empire and the consequences of transgression. This shared experience also fostered a sense of community, as justice was public and communal. For rulers and magistrates, punishment was a tool of authority and control. The ability to enforce law through fear was a demonstration of power. Emperors, who administered harsh justice, were seen as strong leaders, capable of maintaining order in a vast and diverse empire. Yet, this power came with risks. Excessive cruelty could provoke unrest or sympathy for the condemned. Some emperors, like Nero and Caligula, became infamous for using punishment as a means of personal cruelty rather than justice, ultimately undermining their legitimacy. The psychological effects extended beyond individuals to the culture itself. Rome's acceptance of violence as a means of justice shaped attitudes toward law, governance, and human dignity. It set a precedent for later societies, influencing how justice and punishment would be understood for centuries. As you reflect quietly, imagine the tension in the air as the crowd waits. The condemned stands alone, surrounded by silent spectators, the weight of empire pressing down. Justice is not only done, it is seen, felt, and remembered. As we come to the end of this long journey through the wild and often horrifying punishments of ancient Rome, it's worth pausing to reflect on what these practices reveal. Not just about a distant civilization, but about justice itself. Roman opery. Punishments were brutal, theatrical, and symbolic. They combined pain with performance, aiming to maintain order through fear and spectacle. Yet beneath the cruelty, there was a complex system of law, authority, and social control that shaped one of history's greatest empires. These punishments remind us how societies have struggled throughout time to balance justice, power, and mercy. They show the dangers of using punishment as a tool of terror, but also the human desire for order and accountability. Ancient Rome's legacy lives on, in our legal systems, our cultural attitudes, and even in the rituals surrounding Justice today. Though modern societies reject such extreme punishments, echoes of Roman justice remain in the way we think about crime, punishment, and authority. As you rest now, perhaps you can find some peace in knowing that humanity has moved forward, away from the arenas and the wheel, toward systems that seek fairness, dignity, and rehabilitation. Thank you for joining me in this exploration. If you watched until the end, please share your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. What struck you the most? How does the ancient world's harsh justice compare to ours? Your reflections help keep history alive and meaningful. Sleep well, and until next time, this has been Boring History for Slee.